Morning, everyone. My name is Sharon Rich. I'm the Senior Trust Advisor with Aged Trust. Thank you for joining us today for our first webinar of the fall series that we're having. We're having webinars September, October, and November this year. So today we have Jeremy Lau, who's going to speak on a practical guide to cryptocurrency for trustees and administrators, and he's going to be joined by Jared Ong. We have this program. Excuse me, I lost my things here. We do have the program authorized for continuing ed credits, and you will be getting a email from Kate at the end of the webinar within a week on your continuing ed credit certificates and a link to your participation. So we have a large audience today, and I ask that you please put your questions into chat, and we will try to save time at the end to answer them. Thank you so much for joining again today, and I'm going to introduce our speakers. I've known Jeremy for a while. He attends a lot of the same conferences that we at Aged attend. He is the CEO of Prudent Investors, and he frequently speaks on investment management and financial planning to professional fiduciaries, trust and estate attorneys around the country. Jeremy does advise fiduciaries on managing clients' assets and financial planning, and works with estate litigators as a financial expert witness. Joining Jeremy today is Jared Ong. He has 20 years experience in the financial services industry, and before joining Prudent Investors, he worked at Capital Group as a business systems analyst. So I'm going to let Jeremy and Jared take it away. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Sharon. I appreciate that. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen here. Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much. It's good to be with you all. And as Sharon mentioned, we primarily focus in financial planning and investment management. So, as we're going to be talking a lot about cryptocurrency today and digital assets, I guess to be clear, Jared and I are not huge proponents necessarily of cryptocurrencies. We're not, crypto bros, right? So we're not trying to encourage people to invest in cryptocurrencies. The reason why we give this presentation is because for many of you who are on this call, you're going to be coming into cryptocurrencies more and more often, right? A lot of the estates that you come into, a lot of the trusts that you may come into could be invested in cryptocurrencies. And so the question is, what do you do with it? So the purpose of this presentation is really to give people a basic understanding of what cryptocurrency is, how it works, how to administer it. And this was actually a presentation that was put together by Jared a few years ago and was extremely well received by a number of different organizations. And so we've presented on this topic, and as you can imagine, it's been a rapidly evolving topic as well. So so again, as Sharon mentioned, if you have questions, and I imagine there will be some, please do put it in the chat. We're happy to address them at the end. And if we don't have enough time to get to all of the questions at the end, we're certainly more than happy to make ourselves available to talk about it with you. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into it. So I guess the question that some of you may wonder sometimes is, well, where did cryptocurrency come from, and why has it become so prevalent and so popular over the last 10 years? And I guess what I would say is that it really was almost an inevitability. It's a reflection of our understanding and the evolution of the financial system as we know it. So, if you think about, where our financial system evolved from, right? In the very beginning, we had a trade system, right? We had a trade and barter system. For example, if you wanted wheat, you might give somebody your lumber, right? Or if you were looking to get sheep, you might, exchange it for coal. As you can imagine, this could be very inefficient, right? What if the people that you wanted the lumber or sheep from didn't want, what you had to offer, right? And as you can imagine, these types of goods could be very heavy as well. So this is essentially what necessitated the need for currency, right? And initially, when people were using currency, they would use things like seashells or salt, right? That was very common, and eventually this evolved into other things. For example, like more precious metals, right? And people started using gold, and gold as well could be was certainly very precious and a good store of value, but it was very heavy, right? And so that's what necessitated the need to then shift towards using gold coins, right? So people started using gold coins, which had a fixed weight to it. Now, gold coins, though, could also be very heavy as well when you're carrying a lot of gold coins around. Um, and it's also, very easy to have it stolen also. So they thought, okay, well, let's start shifting towards paper currency instead, right? And so that's when we started seeing the use of paper currency. And then paper currency eventually evolved into things like bank notes as well. And ultimately, as they were using this paper currency, this was paper currency that was ultimately backed by gold, right? But as many of you will know, especially during the 20th century, and even starting as early as the late 19th century, we started moving away from the gold standard. And in 1933, essentially the U.S. government took all of the gold back, right, and removed ourselves from the gold standard entirely. Well, people thought, okay, well, we've got this, situation here. Well, rather than writing a check, what if we actually start using cards instead, right? We're going to account for a debit, and a credit, debit from one account, credit another account. We're going to do it through a very modern imprinting machine, right? And so we started doing the transactions that way. And of course, we thought, okay, well, as technology evolved, we were able to get away from that analog system and shift into a more digital system, right? And now we swipe cards. And essentially, we're doing the same thing here, but this is really, the financial system as we know it today, right? And this is what we know as centralized finance, where, for example, if David needs to pay John, right, he can write a check or he can swipe a card, right? And we're going to debit $20 from David's account and credit $20 to John's account. And so this is the system that we all know and understand. Well, people thought, okay, well, this is a centralized financial system. What if we move into a decentralized financial system, right? Where we're going to do the same things, but rather than have David pay John, what we're going to do is we're going to encrypt their identities, right? And essentially do the same thing here. But what we're also going to do is, after we encrypt their identities, we're also going to actually have it on a ledger, and we're going to have it across a network where all of the other participants are going to essentially recognize or reflect that transaction to reconcile the transaction. And this is what is known as decentralized finance, and essentially is sort of the backbone for cryptocurrency. And if we wonder, where did cryptocurrency come from? Well, it was invented by somebody named Satoshi Nakamoto. And Satoshi Nakamoto, we don't know who he is, and we don't know if this is actually even a real person or not, right? But there was a Satoshi Nakamoto who grew up in Southern California. This was his yearbook picture. And as we mentioned, yeah, we don't know who officially made the first cryptocurrency transaction, who executed it. We do know who received the first cryptocurrency transaction, and that was a gentleman named Hal Finney. And Hal Finney actually received cryptocurrency as early as January 2009. And Hal Finney was a genuine master cryptographer. He ended up going to Caltech, a true technologist. And Hal Finney, unfortunately, was diagnosed with ALS a few years later. But to his, I guess, sort of good luck in some sense, he received this cryptocurrency. The cryptocurrency increased dramatically in value. He was able to use a good portion of that money to help finance a lot of his medical care until he passed away a few years later. So, that's where essentially Bitcoin came from. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, we had Bitcoin come in 2009, which was shortly after the financial crisis, right? This was during the time when you had a lot of skepticism and sort of jaded attitudes about the centralized financial system. People felt they couldn't trust banks anymore. People felt they couldn't trust centralized governments anymore, that centralized governments were becoming very reckless with their spending and with their fiscal strategies. And as after we had Bitcoin, then you had the proliferation of hundreds and then of course thousands of other cryptocurrencies as well. And today, the total value of the cryptocurrency market is around $3.7 trillion dollars. So it's a huge number. If you look here, for example, though, Bitcoin alone accounts for more than half of that market cap. So more than half of the overall value of cryptocurrencies that are circulating through the industry today is made up of Bitcoin alone. The second largest is Ethereum, and then it goes down from there. How many Bitcoins are there out there? So if we're curious, what's circulating in existence, you've got close to 20 million Bitcoins out there, a little over a million that are left to be mined. So about 95% of the total Bitcoins have been mined so far. So, what was the appeal of cryptocurrency? Well, cryptocurrency offers a number of different advantages that, sort of necessitated its birth. First of all, as we mentioned, it was, a decentralized system. So it was not controlled by a central authority or such as a bank or government. Um, it reduces the risk of manipulation or potential failure. You also have lower transaction fees, right? You're not having to go through the traditional banking system that could involve a lot of other frictional costs. The transactions could also be completed more quickly, right? They're pretty much instantaneous, and they weren't limited by geographic location. And also, as I mentioned, they were private, right? They could be done pseudonymously. So instead of providing a name, you're providing a wallet address instead. Now, it's not going to be anonymous, right? It's not completely anonymous. You just don't have to provide a name, and we'll get into ways in which these transactions can actually be tracked. Also, it can actually provide greater transparency. So I mentioned, a lot of times people think, when you engage in a cryptocurrency transaction, it's completely private, nobody can see it all, at all. It is recorded on a public ledger. So even though your name might not be, readily visible, it is traceable and verifiable by anybody. Um, and with cryptocurrency transactions, the recipient has direct ownership, right? You have direct control over those cryptocurrency assets through the use of private keys. Also, there's global accessibility, right? So again, it can be utilized globally. You're not subject to borders. You're not subject to various regulatory systems. We know, for example, certain countries may have capital controls and things like that. Those don't apply to cryptocurrency. And then lastly are the investment opportunities, right? So we've seen a number of investors, individuals, speculators. Some people have made significant investment gains from this asset class. Okay, maybe Jared, I'll turn the time over to you here if you could address some of the financial responsibilities of trustees, guardians, and administrators.
Yes, thanks, Jeremy. So one of the things that we feel like trustees, guardians, and administrators need to understand is how crypto applies from their specific role of functioning as a trustee. But before we get into that, we first just want to cover generally what some of the things might be that you end up having to do. So for example, you might need to locate and marshal assets, which would be including update of titling or transfer of assets. You could also have go ahead and click next, the administration and distribution of assets. You're going to invest assets. You're going to need to keep records and file taxes and prepare accounting related forms. And all of this needs to be done according to a fiduciary standard of care. Now, how does this actually apply to cryptocurrency? And that's something that our fiduciaries have had a lot of questions about. So let's discuss crypto storage and distribution. How does that actually work? Before I get into that, if you can just take a step back and take apart the term cryptocurrency. So crypto stands for cryptography and currency is, money. The way cryptocurrency works is that cryptocurrency, the cryptography portion is based on something called asymmetric encryption. And what that means is that you have a private key pair and a public key pair. On the screen, we have this cute little animation of Grandma Alice, and she wants to send a message to her two mustachioed men, but she doesn't want the whole world to know. And so she creates a secret message, which is signed by her private key, and she sends it to her suitors. Now, these suitors have her public key, and they're able to unlock the message. So the key point to remember is that with cryptocurrency, you're going to have a private key and a public key, and that's called a key pair. Now, when I've explained this to people, sometimes that gets a little confusing. So the best way I can orient that to what we know is if we go to the next slide. It's kind of like Venmo. Think of it like Venmo. And on the screen here was one of the first people that really decided Venmo was very convenient. I guess his name was Carson King. Uh, Maybe he was 25 at the time. And the story about this guy was that he decided he needed some extra money for beer, and he went on to ESPN Game Day, and he held up the sign. And this was as Venmo was just starting out. And everybody thought that was really funny. And they texted him a few dollars here and a few dollars there to his public Venmo address. And he ended up getting over $2 million because it was a public address. Well, he was a good guy, and so he ended up donating most of that money to Children's Hospital, and I think he kept something like $15 for his case of beer. But I tell the story to help you understand that with cryptocurrency, and Venmo's not cryptocurrency, but with a public address, anybody can send you money, just like with Venmo, and you have a public address, anybody can send you money. Go ahead and click a second. Now, the private key could be thought of as like your password for your Venmo account, because in order for you to digitally sign a transaction in Venmo and send money, you will need your password. So think of the private key of cryptocurrency as like almost like your password. Okay, go ahead and go to the next slide. So with that understanding, what are custodians actually storing? They're not storing cryptocurrency. What they're storing is the key pair or the private key information. And when you use a custodian, the custodians themselves are going to be like this third party that will supposedly protect your private key information and allow you to make transactions. Now, the well-known custodians, Coinbase, Binance US, and Crypto.com, one of the things that they've done is try to make it very convenient and easy for consumers to be able to buy and sell cryptocurrency. And as part of that, they actually will have reports. Some of them have the processes for deceasing accounts, and they can also generate 1099s. But this is not the same as maybe the investment custodians that you're familiar with, such as Fidelity or Schwab or big banks, because these cryptocurrency custodians are more like fintech companies, financial technology companies, in that they're trying to create a platform for people to trade cryptocurrency. And as the people trade cryptocurrency, they end up making money off those trades. And so they don't have the same level of support that you would expect compared to these investment custodians or banks. So for example, and a disadvantage is that most 1099s that you would receive from these custodians are 1099 miscellaneous, which is essentially going to display any income that you get generated from the cryptocurrency. They're not actually going to sell or show you the buys and sells and allow you to use that information for your taxes. The other potential issue is that if everything is stored at this one location, then you're susceptible to hacking since the information, your private key information, is stored at the custodian. So some key points for the trustee is that most cryptocurrency custodians do not have ways to establish beneficiaries on accounts because these are financial technology companies and they want to do the easiest type of accounts. And most of these types of accounts are going to be individual accounts or in some cases retirement accounts. But places like Robinhood, for a very long time, made it very difficult to establish beneficiaries on the account. And even Robinhood, even though they allowed you to trade cryptocurrency, was not was more advanced than some of these other cryptocurrency custodians. Another issue is that very few cryptocurrency custodians seem to have decent decedent processes in place. And we've gotten calls from fiduciaries that have struggled for months to be able to move the cryptocurrency and administer it. The thing to know is that if a person is using a cryptocurrency custodian such as Coinbase or Crypto.com, they're probably a relatively novice investor in crypto because of the ease of use. And the advantage of that, if you're a fiduciary, is if you discover maybe in their email an account information, at least you know that there's a third-party institution that you can go to try and get uh, the assets or marshal the assets. And they actually do have some customer service. Um, but generally, the customer service is email back and forth, and you won't be able to find an individual like if you are working at a bank or you go into a bank's branch. Um, in terms of cryptocurrency custodians in the industry, if people invest in cryptocurrency, um, there's this concept called own you don't own your keys if you put it with a cryptocurrency custodian. So on this next slide, we want to discuss um, a story of a cryptocurrency custodian in Canada. And now this was one of the biggest crypto exchanges in Canada in 2018, 2019, and its name was Quadriga. And it was started by a guy named Gerald Cotton, and Jennifer Robertson is his wife here, as you can see on the screen. And in December 2018, they were traveling in India as part of their honeymoon, and Gerald Cotton got very sick. And he had a history of Crohn's disease, so that was not surprising. But they rushed him to the hospital, and then 24 hours later, he passed away. And so Jennifer Robertson was very distraught. And she also knew, because he was the CEO of this cryptocurrency exchange, Quadriga, that there should be some sort of transition, something called a dead man switch that would allow the other senior people at Quadriga to be able to access the cryptocurrency. But there was no dead man switch. And so the money was completely lost. At the time, it was about $250 million. Now, there were a couple of strange things as creditors started researching what was going on. And they did find that it was a closed casket burial. The death certificate was spelled incorrectly. And interestingly enough, is that he rewrote his will 12 days before his death. They also found that when he was 15, he went on these message boards that discussed how to do Ponzi schemes. And some of his partners were related to those message boards or had had experience with Ponzi schemes. So the question is, did Gerald really pass away? I do think he has passed away, and maybe some of you have seen some of the Netflix specials on this case. I do think he passed away because I don't think he'd want to have his wife endure all the pain and anguish related to him just disappearing with the cryptocurrency. But this is an example of if somebody stores a cryptocurrency at an exchange or at a custodian, the reason why there might be some potential danger. So if we go through these next slides pretty quickly, this is an example of how much has been done in crypto losses in 2024, which is about 1.5 billion. Now that's slightly down from 2023, which was 1.8 billion. If we go to the next slide, these are examples of some exchanges. Now these are not as well known, but these are also cryptocurrency exchanges or custodians that had hacks done against them. And DMM Bitcoin lost 305 million, while Xerex lost 235 million. So you can see that there is a potential there for hackers to try and steal cryptocurrency given these large dollar amounts. Now, with that being known, a cryptocurrency investor might decide, I don't want to store my cryptocurrency at a custodian in case the custodian gets hacked. And so there are a couple other options. So one of the options is called a hot wallet, which is why we have this uh, amusing picture up on the screen. Now, what exactly is a hot wallet? A hot wallet is an application that is linked on your computer that stores your private key information and public key information. And they're apps. They can be apps on your phone. They could be a plugin to your Chrome browser. But what these applications allow you to do is because they're connected to the internet, you can still trade, you can still buy and sell cryptocurrency. So the advantage is that you're less susceptible to institutional failure because there is no institution. You're the one who's in charge of keeping your private key safe. And because you're connected to the internet, you can still do trading. There's no bureaucracy to deal with. But the disadvantage you're in charge of the records. So there's not going to be any statements of records or tax records. You're going to have to create your tax information on your own. You're still connected to the internet. So if somebody hacked your computer, you could potentially lose your cryptocurrency. And there also is nobody to support you, um, especially if you're a fiduciary. Now, a hot wallet will probably have one password to access the cryptocurrencies inside. And that password is generated from 12 to 16 different words in a specific order. And that's where the cryptography hash comes from. We'll go back to the other slide, Jeremy, 1 second. As I mentioned, hot wallets can be on a phone. And so on the right-hand side of the screen, these are the icons. If, let's say, you're working with your client or you're trying to marshal assets and you do have access to their phone or their computer, these are some of the different types of apps that would represent either a cryptocurrency custodian or a hot wallet. So on the top, Coinbase, Crypto.com, and Binance US, those are examples of cryptocurrency custodians. Right below that are examples of apps that are hot wallets. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. Now, I mentioned the password or the passphrase. When you create a hot wallet, or any wallet, you'll have something called a recovery phrase. And this is an extremely important password. You don't want to lose that because it's the key to accessing the hot wallet. And if you lose your hot wallet, let's say your phone falls in the ocean, you can recreate your wallet by using this recovery phrase. And as I said, the recovery phrase is interchangeable with different wallets. And so what people do is they will take the recovery phrase and they will write it down somewhere or they'll record it somewhere on their computer and they'll have a record of that so that they can recreate their wallet. Okay, next slide. Jeremy, I think you're going to have opportunity to discuss cold wallets.
All right, so let's just kind of take a step back here. So Jared kind of walked us through, right, some of the risks of actually investing with a custodian. And as he alluded to, as if you remember the premise for cryptocurrency, right, for people who want to invest into it or buy into it, oftentimes they're trying to essentially remove themselves from a centralized financial system, right? They don't want to be attached to a government or institutions or things like that, right? So, but because of the convenience, people might use a custodian. But in this case, as you can see, because of some of the risks, they may use a hot wallet, as you just alluded to. So if you're a guardian, for example, or if you're a trustee and you come into an estate, right, and you suspect that your client may have cryptocurrency, Jared pointed out a number of those applications that you would want to check for, right? If you see some of those applications that he was pointing out there, that would be a pretty good sign that your client may have some cryptocurrency, right? Or there could be some private keys that are stored in that hot wallet there. But as Jared mentioned, you are still connected to the internet. There is still some susceptibility to being hacked. So that's what essentially gives us the need to have what's called a cold wallet as well, right? And so the key difference with a cold wallet is you're not connected to the internet, right? And so you can buy, for example, certain pieces of equipment, right? That might be, some type of cold wallet where you can store your private keys. It could be something very simple, actually, right? So it could be something as simple as a USB drive. It could be something as simple as a piece of paper. We've seen though, when if you can imagine if you have something like this that is not connected to the internet, that is not going to be easy to recover or to retrieve, there could be a lot of danger in that. And so I want to share sort of a somewhat famous story. Some of you may have seen this story before of a person who had a cold wallet but lost it, right? And that's why we have this term called HODL, H-O-D-L, hold on for dear life, or else this could be you.
In 2013, a British man accidentally threw away a hard drive. It contained 7,500 Bitcoin. Fast forward to today, the crypto inside that hard drive is worth more than $350 million. His name is James Howells. He's an IT worker from Wales. Over the past 8 years, he's been on a mission to find that hard drive by digging through his local dump. But so far, no luck. He once told NBC News, quote, "It is soul destroying, to be honest. Every second of the day, I am thinking about what could have been." In a last-ditch effort earlier this year, Howells offered his local town tens of millions of dollars to help him find it. In a recent interview with The New Yorker, he said, quote, "I still hope and feel it can be done. And as long as I feel that, I will keep trying."
right? So pretty scary situation, right? That
And
money that he had back then today would be worth close to $1 billion, right? And so he lost it. It was something as simple as a hard drive. Not normally that easy to lose $1 billion, right? But when you're talking about a cold wallet, when you have the private key stored on there, that can happen, and that's what happened to this particular Welsh gentleman. So some of the advantages of cold wallets, right? It is more secure, right? You're not connected to the internet. It's not susceptible to institutional failure either. You can't be hacked. Um, you don't have any bureaucracy to deal with. But the key disadvantages, right? So if you're holding on to something like this because you're not connected to the internet, the presumption is you're not really going to be trading this, right? Trading and liquidation can be very cumbersome. So people who are putting their cryptocurrencies into a cold wallet, these are really sort of buy and hold for the long term, right? These are people who, want to own this for life, essentially. And as you can imagine, there's not going to be any institutional statements or tax records that are going to be provided either. Um, Now, as I mentioned already, the cryptocurrency, again, it's not stored specifically on the cold wallet, right? It's only the private keys. So if he were somehow to be able to recover those private keys, he wouldn't actually need that hard drive, right? If he actually was able to recover the private keys, he could still access those 7,500 bitcoins that he lost. And there are crypto recovery services that can help, right? So essentially, the fees can range here, but typically what we've seen is they'll charge around 20%. And what essentially you're doing is you're hiring somebody to engage in some social engineering to essentially you're paying them to try to hack into your account, right? And so, but what you're trusting is that after they hack into it, if they are in fact able to recover your cryptocurrency, that they're going to give the private keys over to you, right? So, but that's sort of last resort. Okay, I'm going to hand it back over to Jared, and he's going to talk about a case or a situation that we dealt with dealing with the titling of crypto assets.
Thanks, Jeremy. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. If you are coming across cryptocurrency as a fiduciary, what do you necessarily do? Now, it's going to depend on whether or not the cryptocurrency is stored at a cryptocurrency custodian, a hot wallet, or a cold wallet. Now, for hot wallets and cold wallets, there's no institution. And so because there's no institution, there really is no way for you to show somebody else that you have authority to act. Now, granted, if you can recover or you have access to the hot wallet, cold wallet of your client, then that potentially does make it easier for you to administer. But it does also create some issues in terms of avoiding commingling, keeping the key safe, and things like that. What I'm trying to say is that because of the decentralization of cryptocurrency, that there is no specific institution that is probably going to be there to help you unless it's with a cryptocurrency custodian. And even if it is at a cryptocurrency custodian, they have not very standard decedent processes in place. So with cryptocurrency custodians like Coinbase, um, they will ask you for documents such as a death certificate or a last will and testament or probate documents, valid government identification, letters signed by a person named in probate administration. Um, but one of the issues that we have seen fiduciaries run into is that the transfer of assets at a cryptocurrency custodian normally is under the concept that it's a son or a daughter or a relative that is inheriting the currency. They don't necessarily have the procedures in place for a professional fiduciary, professional guardian, professional conservator. And what they ask for is your email address related to an existing account at the custodian that they can move those assets to. Now, if you already have an account with, say, Coinbase, that's going to mean that if they transfer the assets into that account, you're going to be commingling your assets of your client with your assets. So that is a big issue. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Another issue that we've seen, and this is a specific case study that we've run into, is that when you have estate or trust administration, a lot of times these cryptocurrency custodians will not actually recognize a trustee's authority because they won't recognize the legal documents that you provide them. So, for example, In the case that we saw in California, crypto assets were stored at a custodian named Kraken, and those assets were supposed to flow into a trust at the point of the grantor's passing. And that was all on Schedule A. However, the custodian did not recognize that those assets should flow into the trust, and so the assets were held up for many, many months. And even though the attorneys had something called a Hegstad petition, which is similar to what in Florida is called like a petition to determine title, the custodian still did not recognize that those assets should go into the trust. And there was no executor, there was just only a trustee. So that's the example of how, with this nature of decentralization, that these custodians are more financial technology companies, you might run into issues as you're trying to do administration. Go to the next slide. I'll discuss about how you might distribute crypto assets if you are able to get a hold of them. Before we show some slides that show what that looks like, I did want to point out to be very cautious and careful because the private key, as we've shown, is how you digitally sign transactions. And you don't want to learn the lesson that this Bitcoin TV anchor learned, Bloomberg TV anchor learned, which was he was gifting $20 in Bitcoin to his co-anchors. And as they were gifting it, the TV camera showed the QR code. And if you can see in the very top right-hand corner of this slide, it's hard to read, but it says in red, private key. And so somebody as I was watching the broadcast said, well, that's a private key. I can digitally sign a transaction for this person. And they ended up moving the $20 out before the co-anchors could receive it. And so that person posted on Twitter and explained, hey, you really got to protect your private key because I just transferred the money out. And that was a lesson learned to the Bloomberg TV anchor. So you really got to protect the information that you have if you do have that. Next slide. What does it look like to distribute assets in kind? First, you must somehow have the private key in order to digitally sign the transaction. And private keys are normally stored in a crypto wallet. It could be a hot wallet, it could be cold wallet, it could be a cryptocurrency custodian. And you must have access to that wallet or cryptocurrency exchange in order to send transactions from that wallet. If you don't have access to the wallet, but you have access to that 16-word or 12-word key phrase that we showed you earlier, you can recreate the wallet. Then you need to select the cryptocurrency and you need to be very careful that you're actually selecting the cryptocurrency because remember, this is supposing that we're distributing in kind because the beneficiaries want to receive the asset in kind. They don't want to liquidate, say, the Bitcoin or the Ethereum because of the tax situation. So they just want to receive it in kind. You got to make sure that you're actually choosing the cryptocurrency custodian, not choosing the dollar amounts. And you want to make sure that as you're trying to calculate how much you're sending, you are converting this properly. And it can be confusing because each cryptocurrency custodian in each app might look a little different. Then you want to make sure you send it to a public key because as we remember, public key is similar to the Venmo address. So you would need to get a public key of your beneficiaries, and you would then send that cryptocurrency to that public key. Now, transactions are irreversible. So I highly suggest if you're trying to distribute in kind that you'd send a test transaction. We'll go to the next slide. Now, what about distributing in cash? It's pretty similar, but the thing to remember is that a taxable event is created when you're selling crypto assets. And so depending on what the cryptocurrency was purchased, it can be a big tax, and that's maybe why somebody wants to receive it in kind instead. There's something called network fees, which are going to be charged when you actually have to make a transaction to sell the cryptocurrency. And network fees are different than bank fees, where bank fees are normally going to be flat fees. Network fees are going to be varying depending on the time of day, because if the network is very busy and congested, then it might be more expensive to do this transaction. You're also going to have a different type of fee called a service charge, which is the custodian's fee for transferring the assets. You want to link a bank to the custodian so that you can send the funds once it's been converted into cash to that bank. And when you create an account, large custodians will have know your customer rules in place and require the account that's being opened to be like titled. So that can be an issue when marshaling assets because if you're trying to administer a Coinbase account, for example, of your client, but then you're trying to send the assets out to a specific bank that's titled in the name of the estate, there might be issues setting up the connection because those aren't going to be like titled. As I mentioned before, web interfaces will differ between wallet apps and custodian websites. So depending on whatever app your client used, it might be a completely different interface that you're going to have to get used to. Okay. Other key points to remember is that cryptocurrency custodians do not have the same type of regulations. So there's not going to be any customer service to help you. And when distributing in cash, it may take multiple steps in apps, especially if the cryptocurrency was not on a custodian platform like we just showed, but was on a hot wallet or a cold wallet. And so we do recommend talking to your attorney, but consider if you find assets in a hot wallet, cold wallet, you might want to transfer it to a trusted custodian, even though, as we've shown, that there can be some hacking liability. You want to transfer it to a custodian so you're hopefully removing some of that liability because if you are trying to transfer from a hot wallet or a cold wallet that is on your client's computer or phone, then you really are taking on all the liability. We'll go ahead and skip this for time, Jeremy. Yeah. And we want to emphasize that because transactions are stored on a public ledger, that if you are trying to locate cryptocurrency, it is possible for you to determine where cryptocurrency is if it got transferred out, because you can look at things on a public ledger. And so we've helped some estates, we've helped some attorneys in trying to locate cryptocurrency by using the public ledger. In some cases, the attorney has to subpoena the Coinbase, the custodian, such as Coinbase, to be able to get specific records, and then those records can be used to try and digitally locate the cryptocurrency. Okay, and let's go ahead and skip this for time. Yeah, your turn, Jeremy.
All right, so just want to sort of touch on that though. To Jared's point, we did deal with a specific case where we did actually have a client whose crypto was stolen. We were able to trace it. We were able to get the courts involved, subpoena them to actually get it to actually retrieve it, which we were able to successfully do. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about investing cryptocurrency. And again, as we mentioned before, we're not trying to encourage people to invest in crypto. My guess is, from the comments we've had in this presentation and some of the things that we've shared, my guess is maybe you would actually be deterred from investing it, if anything. But I just want to sort of talk for a little bit about how this reconciles with some of the prudent investor standards. Now, there's nothing that explicitly prohibits investing into crypto in the Uniform Prudent Investor Act or in the Florida investment statutes. So that being said, when we're thinking about this, right, we know that as trustees are managing these types of assets, you need to treat and manage the assets just as a prudent investor would, right, considering the purposes, terms. We know, for example, that we have to think about risk-adjusted returns, right? And so when we think of risk, that's generally measured in volatility terms, right? And if you look, for example, at how volatile Bitcoin has been against the S&P 500, for example, we'll have noticed that Bitcoin has exhibited roughly 6 times the amount of volatility of the S&P 500. And that's even as the asset class has matured, right? People thought, okay, well, as Bitcoin is going to be around longer, it's going to become a more stable form of value. It's not going to be as volatile as it has been historically. That hasn't really been the case even still. We're still seeing a lot of volatility in Bitcoin. It is considered a taxable event, right? So when you think about handling cryptocurrencies, whenever you transact in it, if you sell it, right, if you realize a gain, taxes do need to be paid on it. What that also does include that people sometimes overlook is, for example, if you use Bitcoin, for example, to buy a cup of coffee, right, or to make some sort of purchase, what you're essentially doing is you're selling your Bitcoin, transferring it to dollars, and then buying it with that. So it is considered a taxable event that you are realizing a gain or harvesting a tax loss if you've actually lost money on the crypto that you on your crypto holding. Same thing if you're switching out of one crypto into another, right? Selling one crypto to buy a different cryptocurrency, it's treated just like stocks as well. So from that sale, again, you're going to have either a capital gain or loss. Okay, I'll skip some of this here. Again, when we're thinking about this asset class, you need to treat it just like you would any other, financial asset, right? What are the beneficiary's liquidity needs? What is the language that's actually in the trust certification? Sorry, in the trust document. Um, you know, how volatile is this particular asset class? Is there any regularity of income that can be provided from it if needed? Um, Again, what do you do if the trust says specifically to stay invested in cryptocurrency? Do you invest it? How do you invest it, right? Most cryptocurrency custodians don't support trust accounts, although that is changing very quickly nowadays. I'll go ahead and pass the time back over to Jared here.
I think you probably can, you currently don't see our slides, so we'll just kind of summarize. The next slide was keeping records of crypto assets.
Jared, can they not see the slides?
Oh, we turned off the screen share, I think because there is an issue. So I currently don't see your slides. Yeah. There we go. So in terms of cryptocurrency tax basics, cryptocurrency is considered property. And when you buy something with cryptocurrency, that's going to realize a capital gain or loss because you're having to sell the cryptocurrency into dollar to buy something with dollars. So be conscious of that. The other thing is that if we go to the next slide, exchanging cryptocurrencies is not going to be considered uh, realizing a gain or loss. Excuse me, it is going to be considered realizing a capital gain or loss because you're having to sell, for example, Bitcoin to go and buy Ethereum. So that also is going to be a taxable event. What I was trying to refer to was transferring cryptocurrency from one account to the other. That is not a taxable event. Sorry about that. And the IRS allows you to choose different units. It's almost like tax lots to determine which is going to be considered sold and which is going to be considered bought. And when you are selling those tax lots, that if you're choosing the specific tax lots when you're selling cryptocurrency, that is very helpful if you're able to offset any gains through losses. So essentially, you can pick and choose specific lots to offset gains. I will go to the next slide. Now, there are websites and for accountants, specific software that can be used to look at a public ledger and essentially recreate the transactions if you're trying to determine the implication of taxes. But it's still going to be very messy, but at least there is software to support that. These are some examples of software out there. Go ahead and next slide. So let's go ahead and kind of summarize and close up. As we've shown, because of the decentralization of cryptocurrency, there's not going to be the same type of institutional support for you. And so nowhere is a fiduciary needed more than with cryptocurrency. Because if you can show that you understand these issues of hot wallets and cold wallets, of how to transfer assets and how to keep the private key information safe, and you have systems in place, that's going to be far above other people who just are under the paradigm of just investing in crypto. And that's because a former fiduciary who has been replaced could still have access to the private key and the primary key information, the private key information, even though they don't have fiduciary authority to do so. And cryptocurrency's lack of checks and balances compared to traditional finance is your opportunity for you as a fiduciary to show that you are able to be trustworthy, that you're able to protect these assets. Other key points are, what are your cybersecurity policies? What are your onboarding processes if somebody does have cryptocurrency? How are you going to identify where the cryptocurrency is stored? If it's at a custodian, how are you going to marshal them? How are you going to secure the assets? What are preferences and risk tolerances of the beneficiary? Some of them might want to continue to be invested in crypto after you marshal the crypto. What are your processes related to that? And another point to consider is, what is your succession plan if something were to happen to you? Would it be a similar situation to Gerald Kopp? And to close, we do have a list of 10 questions to ask that we can send this audience if it's helpful. And these questions are just a bit of onboarding and will help you if you are bringing on a new client to go through the process of finding out if they do have cryptocurrency and whether or not they already have a hot wallet or cold wallet. And so this is a resource that we're able to provide, and we can send a link to later.
All right, thank you so much, Jared. And we've got some questions here. Maybe if I'll read off the questions. Is that all right, Sharon?
Yes, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, so let's see. One of the first questions here. Uh, this is, can Coinbase set up an account in the name of the estate?
The answer would most likely be no, because I just worked with the fiduciary on this issue 2 months ago, and they currently do not have the ability to open an account for the administrator or the executor to pull the assets into. They are going to ask for an account of an existing account holder, and that ends up being an issue with potential commingling. So no, there isn't a way, as far as I know right now, to open an account in the name of the estate, at least at Coinbase.
Okay,
So if
next.
you're trying to transfer an asset, somebody passes away and, the estate says three people get, the balance of the estate, do those three people have to set up accounts with cryptocurrency type accounts with a custodian? And then
So in that situation, potentially yes. Like, let's say it's an estate and there is no professional fiduciary that's handling the estate, and just the kids know that dad had some cryptocurrency. They would all be sending in their Coinbase account information to Coinbase, and then Coinbase would review the letters of administration, the decedent documents, and then distribute it to those individuals. What the fiduciary that I work with is looking to do is to get a court order and then use that court order as her liability cover, and then gather all the information of the beneficiaries who are trying to get the cryptocurrency and the Coinbase accounts that they have established, and then instruct Coinbase to distribute to those accounts.
Okay, next question. Can a beneficiary be named on a Bitcoin account? Oh, sorry, excuse me. Let's see. I think that was okay. Here's the next question. Why does it require a huge amount of electricity when mining, and how does mining work?
So I think, to cover the first question, Jeremy, the institutional custodians, for example, there's a Coinbase institutional um, uh, Coinbase institutional department. You can have beneficiaries and trust named, but generally for these retail types of custodians, no, you don't see beneficiaries named on an account.
Yeah, Jared and I were dealing with a case like this, and it was a large amount of crypto, so we were able to engage with Coinbase institutional, but it really did need to get escalated to that level to start working to name like trusts or beneficiaries as for the account. In terms of the mining part of it, so the way mining essentially works, and we were showing how those reconciliations are done across the ledger. right? So for all of those other participants who are on the network who are helping to reconcile those transactions, there's a lot of computing power that is utilized in order to do those encryptions, right? And so in order for that reconciliation to occur, you're actually having to expend significant amounts of electricity and power to do that. And so what you're essentially compensated for in engaging in that reconciliation process is you're given a tiny sliver of Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, right? So that's essentially how the mining works. Now, that was a very profitable endeavor for a while when the value of cryptocurrencies were going up exponentially, right? But what people have to think about is if you're going to be engaging in crypto mining, is how much money or how much power are you actually, spending on engaging in this reconciliation process against how much Bitcoin you're actually receiving. But that's essentially how mining works.
And not all cryptocurrencies require huge amounts of mining and electricity. It's unique to Bitcoin because Bitcoin has a finite supply, but there are other types of cryptocurrencies that have been created that mining is not nearly as expensive, or it's not really mining per se in the same concept of cryptocurrency.
And then the last question is, how is the value of crypto determined? I mean, I guess I can speak to this then. The way I would think about crypto is it's essentially a scarce commodity, right? So I wouldn't look at it necessarily that differently from something like gold, right? It's almost like a digital form of gold, except much more volatile and I guess susceptible to things like hacking. But when we think of its scarcity or maybe how people think about it, it's essentially supply and demand. So it's the same sort of idea. Now there are other forces that come into play. Things like they'll have things like initial coin offerings. You'll have other cryptocurrencies that are circulating in the market. A lot of these different cryptocurrencies have various types of functionality and different sort of use cases. And so that may sort of detract or affect, how people view or value other cryptocurrencies. But essentially, that's how it works. There's not a lot of sort of fundamental analysis that goes into crypto like there might be for companies, right? Companies oftentimes they'll do things like discounted cash flow analysis. They'll have analysts who are looking at these companies and sort of meeting with CFOs or meeting with strategists and sort of looking to see what the operations of the businesses are. You don't have that level of analysis going into cryptocurrencies, and it's not nearly as regulated in industry either. So you have a lot more, frankly, like insider trading that happens in the cryptocurrency market than you do in a normal financial like in a normal financial system. Another question: if there is an infinite supply of certain coins, doesn't that make each coin less valuable?
It could, but sometimes the reason why you have infinite supply is you're trying to solve specific problems related to uh, financial systems. So some of the cryptocurrencies that are being developed are being used to combat inflation, for example, in Africa. And even though there is supposedly an infinite supply, there's controls on that supply, so that you can hopefully fight inflation. So, um, would it make each coin more or less valuable? It's going to depend on the usage of the cryptocurrency, if people trust it, and that also will play a part.
Yeah, and you know, as Jared mentioned, I mean, there are certain cryptocurrencies that are specifically designed, for example, to be like a stable form of value. Now, we've seen some of them collapse, but in some cases, they're sort of designed specifically to sort of mirror like the dollar. So, there's going to be more supply coming into it, but that's specifically by design. It's supposed to function that way.
Okay. Well, Jared and Jeremy, thank you so much for shedding a little bit of light on what is a complex thing for many of us. And please look for an email, everyone, from Kate with your continuing ed information that you'll need. She'll send you a link. And I wanted to remind you that we will have another webinar in October. It's going to be on the agent APD system. We have some experts that have a lot of experience in that area. So a lot of good questions I expect will be coming from that and hopefully answers. And in November, I have John Finch from ABLE coming to talk about some of the new changes with ABLE and answer any questions that you all might have. So again, thank you so much. I'm sorry for the interruption today, and I hope to see you again. Thank you.